Well, greetings and welcome to the Environmental Justice Day panel, where we are celebrating a just and equitable vision for creation care by honoring both the past, the present, and future of the environmental justice movement. My name is Laura Kigueva James. I serve as the program coordinator for grassroots community organizing at the General Board of Church and Society. I will be moderating this virtual panel discussion today, along with our current Church and Society Public Health Fellow, Reverend Dr. L.A. McCrae. So for those of you who are watching today and the topic of environmental justice is new, we welcome you. For those of you that are just interested in learning more about Environmental Justice Day, you are in the right place. So to begin, I want to ground us in our why. Why environmental justice? Why EJ? So environmental justice comes from this lineage of resistance, of resilience, and renewal that is deeply centered in the Black experience. Father of environmental justice, Dr. Reverend Bullard states that environmental justice embraces the principle that all people and communities have a right to equal protection and equal enforcement of environmental laws and regulations. So today we gather to acknowledge and celebrate the many ways that the past, the present, and the future of the environmental justice movement has and continues to build towards a just and equitable vision for all of God's creation. EJ Day is a way that we as the church can collectively honor this journey towards a just and equitable vision for creation care. So activist Mustafa Ali has been advocating for EJ Day to become an official national holiday that celebrates the incredible work that climate and environmental justice activists do every day. He acknowledges that EJ Day is a day of education, of action, and of hope. So my hope is that we all leave this discussion today with a desire to learn more about environmental justice and celebrate the EJ leaders who are doing the work in our communities, and to act and to be grounded in a hopeful vision for creation care. Before I introduce our panel discussion for today, I want to share our agenda for our time together with a few instructions. So during the discussion, you will have time to submit questions for the panel. Please place your questions in the Q&A box that is located at the bottom of your screen. And then after the discussion, we will have time for Q&A that will be led by Reverend Dr. L.A. McCrae. And followed by that, there'll be an opportunity for an action, and then we'll close our time with prayer. So today I am very excited to be in conversation with three phenomenal faith and environmental justice leaders. I would like to introduce you first to Reverend Dr. Christopher Carter. Reverend Dr. Carter is the Assistant Professor of Theology at the University of San Diego, where his teaching and research interests are in Black and Womanist theological ethics and environmental ethics, religion and food, and religion and animals. He is a Faith in Food Fellow at Farm Forward and serves as a lead pastor at the Loft at Westwood UMC in Los Angeles, California. He is the author of the up-and-coming book, The Spirit of Soul Food, published by University of Illinois Press, and the debut November 2021. His other publications are Blood in the Soil, The Racial, Racist, and Religious Dimensions of Environmentalism, in the Bloomsbury Handbook on Religion and Nature. And he also co-edited volume, The Future of Meat Without Animals. We also welcome today Reverend Dr. Diane Glaze, who's the Associate Pastor at Christ United Methodist Church in Bethel Park, Pennsylvania. She has a PhD in United States social history with an emphasis on African American and environmental history, and an MDiv in Faith, Health, and Science from Emory University. She is the author of Rooted in the Earth, Reclaiming African American Heritage, that will be published in 2010. She's the co-editor to Love the Wind and the Rain, African Americans and Environmental History with Mark Stoll with the University of Pittsburgh Press, and has a forthcoming book, Black Eco-Theology Through History. And lastly but not least, we welcome Helen Smith. Helen is a graduate of Pennsylvania State University with a degree in international relations. She has worked with the National Religious Partnership for the Environment since 2019. Helen was a preliminary editor for Journey to Transformation 2020 Lenten Study by Bishop Sharma D. Lewis. And she has been an international volunteer building churches, schools, and clinics. Helen has been active in the United Methodist Church throughout her life, serving as a chair of trustees and a member of the Finance and Administrative Council and the Rappahannock River, I hope I got that right, Helen, District Board of Connectional Ministries, and the Virginia Conference Communication Board. We thank you all for your expertise and participation today. So as we prepare to enter into this conversation, I do want to take a moment to recognize a significant part of our past American history that informs our present and future commitment to environmental justice. So Environmental Justice Day, EJ Day, falls on August 29th, which is the anniversary of Hurricane Katrina. This year will be the 16th anniversary of Katrina. The inequities that happened in the midst of Hurricane Katrina in many ways have foreshadowed the continued inequities that Black, Brown, Indigenous, and communities of color have faced amid this pandemic and the ever-growing climate crisis. To honor this reality and recognize the lineage of resistance and resilience that has carried us is important as people of African descent and as the church. So I would like to offer this brief reflection from Reverend Dr. Diane Glaze's book, Rooted in the Earth, Reclaiming African American Heritage. May we hold these words true, and may we hold the truth that they give. So when the hurricane hit, African Americans were trapped all across New Orleans, and many of them died. Unlike whites and the more affluent, many poor African American elderly, physically and mentally ill residents did not have the access to transportation to escape the city, which left them more vulnerable to the environmental devastation of Katrina. The plight of African Americans exposed to disease by the putrid water in New Orleans echoes the experience of Africans who died of disease and starvation after they were captured by whites in Africa and transported to the Americas in dark holds of ships during the Middle Passage. And similarly, African Americans wading through the post-Katrina muck mirrored the African Americans who survived the 1927 Mississippi flood. As was true during slavery, towns and cities along the Mississippi were rebuilt on the backs of African Americans as they were forced and coerced into repairing the levees after the flood. In the 21st century, Central American immigrants from places like Mexico, Guatemala did the backbreaking work after Katrina. Church, beloved people of God, as we recognize the lineages of environmental justice, may we never forget our past. May we always recognize the power that we have in our present moment to create change, and may we keep building towards a future for all of us. So in the spirit of resistance, of resilience, and a hopeful future, I want to turn the conversation over to you, Pastor and Dr. Ethicist, Reverend Dr. Christopher Carter, by asking you this simple question. What is environmental justice, and how does environmental justice inform our call as people of faith to care for God's creation? I turn it over to you.
I gotta unmute myself. Thank you so much for the introduction earlier and for the excellent question as a jumping off point for my little brief talk today. So I think it's first important for us to situate what we mean when we talk about justice, where we can begin thinking about what we mean by environmental justice, because I think in many respects, justice as a term carries the weight of so many things, and environmental justice allows us to hone in on this particular topic. So what do we mean by justice? Now, I would argue and suggest that a Christian understanding of justice should be grounded in these three pillars I have listed on the screen here. And you might be not surprised that I basically am taking the Wesleyan, what we call the Wesleyan quadrilateral, and really combining the last two in terms of reason and experience into just talking about the real world, I think is one way to look at it. So first, it must be grounded in scripture. And so as you see here on the left, I've taken these three passages from, especially from Micah and Luke, that really speak to the prophetic tradition that emerge from the prophetic tradition that talk about the role and idea and ideals of justice within this ancient Israelite community that eventually becomes this kind of religious tradition that evolves into Christianity, right? This quote from Isaiah saying, you know, to seek justice, to help the oppressed, to defend the poor, or to defend the orphan, to plead for the widow, right? This is Isaiah commanding those folks who, in his argumentation, his understanding, had begun to slip away from the path they had been set upon. Then Micah, similarly, when defining justice, talks about it being rooted in love and humility, right? In terms of how we're supposed to actually be this kind of embodiment of God in the world with respect to how we care for others. And then Jesus really takes these passage when he emerges from his time in the wilderness and quotes from the Isaiah scroll. He really gives us what Martin Luther King refers to as the mission statement for the church today, where he says, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me because he had anointed me. He has sent me to preach good news to the poor, proclaim release to the captives, to liberate the oppressed, and to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor." These scriptures, I believe, really give us a framework when we're talking about justice, right? It should be to help those who are marginalized. It should be to particularly take care of those who have been dispossessed and feel alienated, who are literally orphaned, and for those who are suffering for any number of other circumstances that allow us to have some sense of empathy, right, with them. Tradition, as we understand it, you know, comes from both the Methodist tradition, but also the church tradition. And we have to be clear too, when we're talking about tradition, it's often easy for us to just lean into some of the, because there's so much to lean into, perhaps some of the traditions of the church that have been problematic, some traditions of the church that have been flawed and harmful in the ways in which we have theologically justified harm. But what I want to suggest is there is always and has always been a counter history to those traditions, right? There's always been folks on the other side resisting those dominant cultural narratives, whether they be from our Roman Catholic brothers and sisters like Cesar Chavez and Dorothy Day, or from people, as I mentioned, like Howard Thurman, Dr. Martin Luther King. There's a way in which the tradition we can glean from, right, talks about what justice looks like, what justice feels like, and what justice requires of us. And then the real world, right? This is also something we have to look at our situation today. And there's two, I would argue, primary aspects we need to be concerned with when we're talking about paying attention to the real world. Because really, I would think there are scholars, I would say, will argue there's two sources of injustice that we have to confront today. One is an overemphasis on privacy and freedom. And we see this playing out right now as we're dealing with the issues of even just the public health crisis we're in with respect to masks and the kind of language people talk about with respect to freedom, this kind of ways in which you prioritize the individual over the community. And then also this kind of detached and overwhelming sense to consume, this notion of essentially replacing the kind of affective dimension of community with the pursuit of consumption, the pursuit of those goods. And that pursuit, again, alienates you from yourself and alienates you from your community. And so with this kind of understanding of the real world, recognizing that we should be mindful of this overemphasis on privacy and freedom, and definitely careful about the way we talk about consumption, we can begin to kind of fashion together what we mean by this notion of justice. I want to suggest that Christian justice means consistently and actively working to see that individuals and groups, especially vulnerable populations on the margins, are given what they are owed. It will be especially skeptical of practices which promote violence, consumerism, and autonomy. Now, from that as a jumping off point, we can begin to think about what does this look like for us with respect to environmental justice, right? How do we boil this down? Or on the individual level, theologically, what we see is this call to make sure that our own individual actions are moving towards sustainability, that we reduce our ecological impact. So these are about the individual choices you make and the choices perhaps your family makes, right? So that means the clothes you buy, the food you eat, the car you drive, the places that you shop, right? The basic everydayness, those who you vote for, I would argue, fits into this kind of notion as well. And then secondly, we have to do the work of building a society where the benefits and burdens of pollution are shared equitably by all people, right? The benefits and burdens, because once we get to that place where we're talking about equitable distribution of harm, we see the dynamics change where people are more concerned about what they're dealing with rather than offloading so much of the environmental degradation onto marginalized communities and communities of color. And so in this sense, I just want to close by saying this for us as people of faith is really an invitation to love. It's an invitation to love. Environmental justice is a way for us to specifically think about what does it mean to love in ways that builds up our communities. If you believe that justice is the ability to treat all people fairly, to include all people in community decisions, and to work towards God's vision of integrated and equal future for all created beings. In this sense, it really is an invitation to actualize the greatest commandment with respect to in the environment, to love God, to love neighbor, and to love self, right? To love ourselves enough, particularly if we come from a position of privilege, if we find ourselves in the West, to do that internal look, to examine our own patterns of consumption, to love our neighbors enough to take seriously when they critique our consumption, they critique our policies, when they critique us, to listen to them, and to love God enough to see this as God's creation, to not assume and operate from this perspective that we own it, right? But to recognize that in truth, this is something that we should be grateful for, that we are charged to care for in order to actually have a sustainable life. And so in many ways, I want to close by saying that I think we have an opportunity to really kind of take either two paths. One might say we can go the path of revolution, where we really think about this kind of sweeping and comprehensive way to change so many things, particularly in terms of how we do church and what that means. Or I might also say we take this path of reform and I might revise what we do. It's kind of a little path, I would argue, a little bit of both. So thank you. I appreciate the opportunity to speak. You probably see my son in the screen as well. Maybe you don't, but he's popping his head in there. He probably has a little bit something to say as well. So thank you again for the opportunity to share, and I look forward to your questions and your thoughts and comments.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much, Reverend Dr. Carter, and grounding us in what justice is. I think that was powerful. And hello to you. Hopefully you can come in and join us for a question and answer session later. Wonderful. So up next, we'll turn it over to Reverend Dr. Diane Glaze. And my question for you, again, what is environmental justice? And historically, how has the church, specifically the Black church, played a role in the environmental justice movement? And why is this history and the knowledge of this history important for the church's present and future engagement in climate and environmental justice advocacy?
Well, thank you for your kind invitation to speak and participate in this Environmental Justice Day panel. I'm grateful to Church and Society of the United Methodist Church for making this happen, and I am thankful to Laura, who organized and took care of so many logistics that made this happen. And I'm grateful for the important questions that have been asked. Many thanks to everyone who is attending today. Now, in the time that I have been gifted to share with all of you today, my focus is the Black church never left the outdoors. In this first and introductory slide, African Americans are gathered together for baptism in Alexander Grinninger's painting, which isn't dated. He lived from 1865 to 1941, so perhaps he took the photo in adulthood when cameras were more readily available. At the center is an elderly woman, and perhaps on either side is the pastor and a leader of the church. Note both are male, reflecting gendered roles in the Black church. They may be Baptists, the largest denomination, who tended to do baptisms in lakes and rivers, unlike the more buttoned down Black Presbyterians. But more importantly, what does the water mean? Water baptism is a ritual rooted in Christianity, a way of publicly confirming one's commitment to God and a renewed life as a Christian. Perhaps African influences also remained, though not quite as clear, with reference to using water for purification, pure body, pure spirit, and libations, pour water to honor God, lesser divinities, the ancestors, and nature. In addition, water spirits are part of many cultures, including Africa. Taken together, consciously or subconsciously, the participants went to nature, a river or a lake, rather than the indoors for water baptism, perhaps a nod to distant African ancestry and the incredible importance of nature. Now, the complex meaning of water, including baptism, is part of the story of African Americans, the environment, and religion. Now, consider the people of the African diaspora in relationship to nature and religion, a proto-ecological spirituality. Such an eco-theology is based on scholarly interpretations of negative and positive impacts that humans have had on what some consider to be God's creation. These environmental impacts by humans have been more adversely affecting Blacks, including what today we call environmental racism. Now, the geographer Juliana Monte describes such racism as the effects on health and environment, as well as unequal environmental protection and environmental quality provided through laws, regulations, governmental programs, enforcement, and policies. Now, with the stories of repression are also empowerment. For African Americans, Black eco-theology has been a practical and practiced theology with historical foundations. Much like their African predecessors, African Americans intertwined spiritual and lived experiences with nature. At times, this was through the lens of surviving and in some instances, overcoming racism, including one of its worst manifestations, enslavement. Now, in this next slide, let us consider this proto-eco-spirituality in Africa that preceded a more formalized Black eco-theology in the United States. Note the earth or mud structure of an African gatekeeper, a healer, who is viewed as a spiritual link at the crossroads between spiritual and human worlds. The following are generalizations of beliefs and practices that vary from tribe to tribe and country to country in Africa, which might have been followed by such a gatekeeper. The interconnectedness of human spiritual and environmental realms, belief in that harm toward or care of one necessarily affected the others. In agriculture, life and death in planting cycles. Farmers consecrated the soil, sources of spirituality, nourishment, and life to people. Honored the dead with ceremonial burials, while returning nutrients to the soil. Now, Africans fully formed in African spiritual beliefs were violently yanked from Africa, their homeland. As we look at another slide, through the Middle Passage, whites forcibly transported Africans across the Atlantic to the Americas to be enslaved from the 16th to the 19th centuries. Now note the image of the Africans packed body to body in the hold of the ship. Chained down, they contracted dysentery, malaria, yellow fever, along with vermin that were crawling across them, including rats. Now in these holes, whites continued to strip away the humanity of human beings they treated as cargo, as things. Once Africans arrived, they were sold and enslaved like animals. Whites ultimately referred to them as chattel, which means livestock. This is a cattle or pig. The very meaning of any connection to the environment, including cultivation of the land, moved from freedom to oppression, from life-giving to destruction. Now consider the brutalized contemporary Black bodies of the 21st century described by Ta-Nehisi Coates in relationship to slaves forced into brutalized labor without pay in places like fields, barns, and the woods. Now on these ships, the meaning of life, religion, and nature began to be transformed in such dramatic ways. A Black eco-theology began to evolve once Africans arrived in the Americas and were enslaved. The theology was more formalized by scholars beginning in the 21st century. Now, according to Marta Warnowski, Black eco-theology is a religious approach that emphasizes the interconnections between human spirituality and liberation, environmental awareness and activism, and the special role of the Black population in these processes. Now, one approach to interpreting nature is through Black eco-theology. It is a theology for and by African Americans who depend on God and Scripture to mentally, spiritually, and emotionally survive nature. Though the oppression and destructiveness shattered African Americans, they were resilient and adapted out of a lived theology of nature. Know that aspects of African ecological spirituality were retained as African Americans drew on and blended in Protestantism, the primary religion of the US or the enslavers. Looking at another slide, consider two examples of practical implications of straddling African and white religion influences in a new world. Now, in the first, African Americans were gathered together in places called brush arbors, used for revivals and worship services during and after enslavement in the United States. African Americans worshiped in these outdoor spaces, often covered by branches for worship, including revivals, far from the gaze and control of white slaveholders. Now, in this next slide, in the 20th century, and it's an example, it's more current, Kapia J. Keoma, who is African and an author of the Creator Symphony, African Christianity, The Plight of Earth and the Poor, describes his own modern experience based on African spirituality and Catholicism. So we'll bring it full circle from Africa to African Americans and back to Africa. And this is what he says. I grew up believing that creation was sacred. We were seriously warned never to despise any creature we encountered in the forest. Doing so was inviting the wrath of the Creator and the ancestors. All these lessons built in me the sense of interconnectedness to the natural world, something my Franciscan spirituality later confirmed. Keoma speaks out of African and white contexts and influences. His contemporary perspectives is informed by historical experiences of people of African descent and the Catholic Church. Now, environmental justice remains a spiritual and a practical issue. People are suffering inwardly and outwardly because of environmental equity that seep from the past into the present and future. Abandoned lots and overcrowded housing in impoverished places are essentially racialized landscapes where Black, Indigenous persons of color, or BIPOCs are forced to live and work. That is environmental inequity. We also see the impact of climate change, including soaring temperatures in urban settings that impact BIPOC more adversely than whites. The results include death and relocation. This is environmental racism. All of this has roots in the ecological subjugation of the enslaved in the woods, in the fields, and on water. Environmental justice is a means of making these things right, making things right in the past, to the present, to the future. This calls on all of us, whether we are in secular or religious contexts or settings. So I thank you for your time.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Reverend Dr. Glaze, and just taking us through history and also taking us to today, in which environmental justice is both a sacred practice that is deeply connected to our spirituality. So thank you for naming that for us. So next, I want to invite Helen Smith. So excited. Yes, you've been a United Methodist your whole life and also an alumni of the Ethnic and Young Adult Program. So my question for you is, what is environmental justice, and how has environmental justice, the movement, influenced the church's advocacy on creation care?
Thank you. I'm really excited to be here with you all tonight and speak on this. So I get to work on environmental justice on a daily basis, which is a huge privilege, really. And I get to spend my days really focusing on the morals and tenets of the faith practice that I grew up in and hold very dear to me. And so I thought about what is environmental justice, because that terminology gets thrown around a lot, and I don't think we spend as much time really focusing on what does that mean. So I went to the Bible and the scripture, and I started looking through to figure out, okay, so God talks about justice over and over and over, but where is a definition, you know? And I found Proverbs 31:9, which says, "Speak up and judge fairly, defend the rights of the poor and the needy." And that really stuck out to me, because when we look at justice as a terminology, we see hand in hand how it goes with mercy. And we are really good at mercy in a short term, but justice speaks to the long term of any kind of tangible solution. And then I moved on to what is environment. It has become the catchiest phrase, and it makes sense to say environmental justice. But when we speak on environmental justice, it gets easy to lose parts of the environment. We often think of the jungles or the rainforest, the animals. We rarely think of the earth as a whole, of every single thing that God has created, and of our fellow humans. So much of the work that we are doing now is recognizing the lack of equity we have had for our fellow humans, and the ease with which, unfortunately, we have spent time dehumanizing each other for our own gains. So when I think about what is environmental justice, I think about so often we see the world as like a circle, and there's all the animals and plants and humans in the center. And really the humans should be hand in hand with all of the animals and all of the plants, because that is where God put us. God set us down and said, you get to take care of this. Not you have to, you get to, and that's huge. We get to take care of this space. And so it also means we get to remove our ego from this work. We get to choose to say, whatever is accomplished is not mine, it is ours. And just as whatever is accomplished is not mine, it is ours, whatever is done poorly is ours. I often spend time thinking about Isaiah praying to God and saying, we sinned. How do we do better? How do we right our wrongs? Despite the fact that it was Isaiah's community that was sinning. Isaiah did not try to separate himself, and he did not try and say, they've been sinning, how do I fix it? How do I make them see the correct move? He said, we have sinned. I am included. I have perpetuated actions that are unhelpful and against your call. And I am a part of the problem until you have showed us a solution and I can work hand in hand with my community to do better. And that really brings us to, how has the environmental justice movement influenced the church's advocacy on creation care? And I thought a lot about this, and I thought a lot about uplifting ourselves and the hope of the message, because oftentimes it can be kind of dismal when we see the ways in which creation has not been cared for. But I remembered that part of love is accountability. And so I cannot personally say that I have seen a humongous influence on the church's advocacy for creation care on a local level. On a national level, we do phenomenally. Just this year, I was a part of helping the United Methodist Women put together a day of advocacy, and we had 48 states that participated and were advocating on clean energy and caring for people and transportation. And it was such a fantastic event. It was so cool to get on the line with women in Arizona as they had their speech down. They were ready. They were going to hold their representatives accountable and advocate for what mattered and for God's creation. But when we look at how we have been influenced as churches, as districts, as conferences, we don't see that same influence because we're working with a trickle-down method that isn't working. And the churches that are doing this really great work are kind of siloed off. So while I haven't seen as much influence on the church's advocacy as I would like, I see a lot of room for improvement and expansion and ways in which we can help each other and de-silo churches who are doing it, to pair people together and say, here's how we're doing it, here's what we're doing, here's how you can advocate, and to really impress upon people that advocacy is their call. Advocacy is not separate from your faith practice or your religion. Advocacy is an extension of the call in Genesis to care for this earth. And so I'm just really excited about the ways in which we can expand and do better and come to God saying, we did mess up some, but we're ready to do the work and be better. And please tell us how, because we're going to say yes and we're going to do it. So thank you so much. I'm really excited to be here and to hear from others in this field and to gain some hope and perspective.
And Helen, thank you so much for the reminder that advocacy is a part of our call. That is such truth. And just thank you. That was great. If you have questions for any of the panelists, feel free to drop it in the Q&A box. And also our chat is open. So we would love to hear too how you at a local level, kind of the call that Helen presented, are doing the work of environmental justice. So we will take a moment for that. LA, did we have any questions in the chat that you came across?
I did not see any questions in the chat. But
okay.
Folks, feel free to drop them.
Okay. Well, while we wait for those questions, if the panelists can come back off on video, actually, and we can just jump into the additional questions that I have around justice and equity and climate reparations. So I'll present both questions and feel free to respond to either. The first is this question of, with this knowledge and breadth of the environmental justice movement that centers specifically the Black experience, what does it look like for the church to advocate then for justice and equity for creation care that is grounded in an environmental justice and EJ perspective? So that's the first question. And then I'll present the second question on climate reparations. So as you may know, you may not know, Church and Society had an incredible webinar series done by my colleagues on reparations in the US, where we talked about the importance of repairing the harm of colonization, genocide, slavery in the US through the process of reparations. Maxine Burkett, who is a law professor and the senior advisor with the Office of Special Presidential Envoy for Climate, and the lead researcher on climate reparation, she says that climate suffering is uneven. And we must properly diagnose the problem to repair the climate crisis and not repeat the decades and centuries of harm. So Burkett advocates that reparations are to right wrongs and forge relationships, and specifically in the case of the climate crisis. So the second question I have here is, as we advocate for a just and equitable climate solutions, what is the role really of climate reparations, and how can the church engage in this long-lasting solution? So I know those are two heavy-hitting questions, but hopefully that can get the audience thinking if they have additional questions to ask. So I'll open it up to you all.
So I have answers for both of these. My first thing on reparations is, when I read the question in preparation, I was disappointed because we've been told what to do and how to have long-lasting inclusion. If we are talking about reparations, we are going to disseminate reparations. We should not be asking, how can we be involved when we have money as a church? And we have people who've been oppressed by our church. So really what I'd like to see in terms of long-lasting solutions is the church saying, we are pledging X amount of dollars to these churches and these organizations to be paid over X amount of time. We are going to act appropriately. We're going to disseminate the funds that we owe the Black community. And if we are truly going to be genuine in acting and calling anything a reparation, we are going to be paying people, because anything less comes off as very disingenuous and unacceptable. And that really plays into how we are advocating for justice and equity when we are grounding ourselves in environmental justice. The Black church has been doing so much for so long, as Reverend Dr. Glaze spoke about so eloquently. But the church as a whole, as United Methodists, is not ready to advocate. We are in a space where we need to be listening so that we may then, as I said earlier, decenter ourselves and then ask ourselves, how can I take my voice to amplify those who are doing this work? Because Black pastors, Black churches, Black Methodists for church renewal, Afro-Indigenous peoples can advocate for themselves about their needs and the ways they are misrepresented and what their priorities are. And it is our role to advocate for them in terms of saying, we are listening to you, we are amplifying you, we are paying you for your time and your emotional labor. And those are the ways that we can genuinely be involved in an EJ movement if we are centering a Black experience.
I'll respond to the first question. I struggle a little bit with it because I'm one that advocates for interfaith. And so I want the tent to be broader than creation care. And you can probably tell from my talk that I framed a lot of things in terms of African spirituality, but we have brothers and sisters who are of the Islamic faith, Judaism, etc., that I think should be incorporated in this. And they're links because we have some common texts, but they're often set on the edges as, sort of spectators when we talk about creation care. The other piece that I struggle with creation care is that early on, its predecessor was dominion. And dominion has been one historically where it has been control over assets, control over human bodies, including African Americans and Native Americans and women. So we move forward to creation care, but it is a movement that is for and of white people. So I'm not saying that we should throw out creation care, but we need other ways of looking at the theology, the spirituality. In South Africa, there is a word, I think it's Ubuntu, And it basically talks about the interconnectedness of life, and it connects the ancestors, God, humans, and nature. And when we think about Christianity, we compartmentalize all these things. They are separated from one another. They are not woven in healthy sort of ways. We still silo what we do in terms of nature when it comes to the Christian church and the United Methodist Church. So I don't know what the language is, but I've started to grapple with it in what I presented today. And in many ways, the tent needs to be bigger.
I guess what I would add to the conversation that will be a slight deviation, I think, from what the other two panelists have said, but not much. I think one, I want to really echo what Dr. Glaze just said about the language that we use, and kind of the theological conundrum that we find ourselves in. What I want to suggest, and what I argue in my forthcoming book, but also in the chapter that I wrote, is that we have a problem within, broadly speaking, the Christian tradition with theological anthropology, what it means to be human and how we understand ourselves as human, connected both to God and to others and to non-human nature, right? And what is it for us? Being human has been, by us, I'm talking about Western Christianity, has been so wrapped up in whiteness, I think, so that when we think about even with the environment, it's this kind of disconnect. It's very much this dominion trope that Dr. Glaze has just laid out, right? That comes from this idea of what it means to be seen as a full human being, that's wrapped up in white male, heterosex, all those categories, right? And so I think that is the problem that is percolating underneath so many challenges we have within the church. And I think particularly when we're looking at people of color, colonialism is at play within respect to how we even believe what it means to be our true sense of our true selves. And so what I've done is really lean on the work of womanist theologians, especially queer theologians, to try to challenge these kind of normative assumptions about what it means to be human. And what I've, in doing so, I think I would say that there are, particularly I'm thinking about Dolores Williams and her notion and the work that she did in the 1980s about talking about understanding salvation beyond the cross, but looking at this ministerial vision, right? This notion of inclusion, this notion of work, this idea that part of salvation, the salvific message of Christ, isn't death on a cross. It is to live in community, to claim our own human dignity, and to empower those to claim their dignities themselves. And within that, and within their stories, that is inclusive of their environments. And so I think some of the tools are there. It really is a matter of language and how we frame it. Now, with all that being said, I also want to recognize and note that I come from a rural family, right? Rural Black folk, farmers. And so these folk, I would say that when I was just at home talking to them literally a few weeks ago, the language of creation care and some of those things is somewhat foreign to them, but the ideologies that they use to talk about caring for nature emerges from this notion of interconnectedness, right? It's the so there's this latent understanding of the value of non-human nature, of us being connected to it, and us being connected beyond that as well, like to our ancestors, that is already present and there. And so making sure that we lift up and center those kinds of theological voices and those kinds of frameworks, I think, is going to be crucial for how the church might begin to move forward. So this is both a learning and unlearning. It's a decentering of some of the dominant voices and a recentering of others. But I also don't want to put like Black churches purely just on this pedestal and saying they have all the answers, or other churches of color, because that's not been specifically the case in the work that I do with food justice, and the ways in which that can be often put in a separate category outside of the environment, or just focused on urban to the detriment of rural communities who are deeply, deeply suffering. So I'm talking about my family's from Hammond, Louisiana, right? Like this is super rural, right off Cancer Alley. And so just seeing the ways in which they might, some of them, many of them, think of food justice as something altogether different, not necessarily theologically connected. So there is work to be done in so many groups, right? So I just want to make sure I name that. And I would argue that where I see Dr. Glaze going, and where I see Helen gesturing towards as well, is this kind of re-understanding of what it means to be human and our relationship with non-human nature, with each other as humans, and also our relationship with God.
Thank you all. I mean, I'm just nodding my head like amen, amen, and amen. Just the truth and the also the acknowledgement of how important language is. and then how we expand this understanding for really in an interfaith connection as well. So I appreciate that. Thank you. Reverend Dr. LA, I think we got a couple questions. I'll turn it over to you.
We do. The first question is from Ms. McFadden. Says, my heart is broken by the history and the current multi-layered system in place. I want to be a positive voice, but I also know I have a lot to learn. How can I learn more and come alongside you in this work? And I throw that out to the panelists.
I guess the brief answer I'll have, and I'll be curious as to what other panelists have to say, is I would try to find local agencies in your area that are doing this work and really support them. Like literally just say, how can I help? And often that could be financial. It could be maybe volunteering your time. But the reason I suggest financial resources to consider as well, if that's an opportunity for you, is because so often, in my experience working with grant organizations, they tend to give money to the same kind of organizations all the time, or they make organizations that where people look like me compete for the same amount of money, even though they're actually doing the kind of community work they suggest want to get done. So that way they can say, hey, we are supporting this this particular effort that's diverse, but they only want to do one, rather than actually being able to support the multitude or actually perhaps doing more work. And so then it gets those organizations competing against each other. And so I would suggest looking in your local community or folks who are doing this work and people you believe in that you want to help support, and starting there, I think will be it. Because then you are a stakeholder in what's happening in your own particular community as well. You can bring your own kind of critical thinking and lens to it.
I would second that, especially the financial contribution part. That is always something that many organizations need, especially the smaller ones that are doing a lot of the grassroots work. In terms of learning more, that is a big thing to do. And I would say, first, give yourself grace. You have been born into a system that has prioritized you. And so beating yourself up about that is not going to help you in this situation. What will help is Google, read books, seek people out who have already put together resources of education. The best way to learn is to learn in ways where people have done this labor and this is their job, versus seeking out emotional labor from anyone around you that just happens to be a person of color. There's a huge distinction there. And so, yeah, start with some books. Reverend Dr. Glaze written one, Reverend Dr. Christopher has written one. Like, there's so much out there. You can start with Womanist Theory. Dr. Amina Wadood, I will put her name in the chat. She's a Muslim imam, and she has incredible womanist theory. She is also Black. And so there's so many things that tie into that tie into Abrahamic religion. And it's a great starting point for learning more about these complex issues and the ways in which different layers affect different oppressed communities.
One of the next questions we have in the chat invites us to consider how to balance all of the information and the bills and the legislation and still being in the work and service of the church. So I read that question as balancing public advocacy, public engagement, and also the hands-on grassroots door knocking. Reverend Dr. Glaze, ministering at the bandos as a part of environmental justice. I'd love to turn that question over to y'all as well. Sorry, I started answering part of it while I was asking it, y'all.
I can hop on this one. It does get incredibly overwhelming. There are so many causes. The best advice I got when I started in this field was, not every fight is yours to take on. So I would say pray. Pray, walk in nature, spend time with God in the ways that make you feel full, and figure out what breaks your heart most or what you feel most passionate about, and focus on that. Because we can't all do all of it, and you can't pour from an empty cup. But when you focus very clearly on relationship building in your community and the things that you are most passionate about, then you are fulfilling your call to God.
Yeah, amen. I just affirm that. And I think definitely prayer, I would just add prayer, and it's a balance, right? A balance that requires this reminder too of like, what are our values in this work? What informs the why we enter into spaces, and what we choose to do and what we choose not to do, to make sure that we are deeply in alignment with where we are being called with our gifts and our resources. Because we could do everything, but that's exhausting. And I don't think that we are created to do everything as much as we are created to do the specific things that God has called us in our gifts, in our talents, in our voice. So I just would add that as well. I think we have time for one more question, and there are a couple of questions in the chat. LA, what did you see, or what would you like to share?
I saw a question down here from Eutha Hardman Cromwell. Hey, Wesley fam. It says, Western culture is so focused on individuality. The church has brought into this relegation community as the way to be in God's will in a way that makes environmental justice find little foothold. How can the concept of community in our discipleship help with creating an atmosphere for environmental justice, be a priority among the faithful?
Well, I think that discipleship is important. I think that discipleship is important. It's a central tenet of who we are as a church. I always pivot. Let us look to our African ancestry, in which community and family and people in one's village, they're valued, and there's an interconnectedness. So I think that we can sort of develop a holistic way of looking at this that brings in or brings back in important cultural tenets that come out of African spirituality. And we can draw from other cultures too, Native American culture, in terms of the sense of community. So I think we can study it all and we can apply it all.
The only thing I would add to what Dr. Glaze just said is, honestly, if you just, the Bible is written and it is a communal book. Like, it's written by folk who lived in community. It is so communal that it continues to baffle me how we individualize. Like, literally, that's why I'm like, I laugh. I'm like, this makes no sense. It's a hermeneutical lens that we are applying to it, right? And so then I believe the invitation, therefore, is to, when we begin to do that, when we do this kind of interpretation of the biblical text that centers the individual, to ask ourselves, okay, where is the community present in this text? And more often than not, what we're going to find is the community tends to supersede the individual, whether you're talking about the Hebrew Bible, especially the Hebrew Bible, but also the New Testament text as well. And so this is I would say, even starting with the text within our own tradition, we can read it with a new lens and a new, with new eyes, to actually see what's already there, right? And that's not to say it's inclusive of everybody, because Lord knows it did not include women and children and people that are disabled, right? So I'm not saying it's like perfect, but I'm saying it definitely talks about community in ways that within American culture, I want to be clear, we historically have not. So yeah, start with the Bible, change your lens, add some other religion, like Dr. Glaze said, and then you got this amazing combination of, I believe, a combination that can really give us some clarity as to how we move forward.
Amen. Well, thank you, Helen, Reverend Dr. Diane Glaze, Reverend Dr. Christopher Carter, for this dynamic and just timely conversation in this moment. This has been such an enriching time. So We want to briefly move to a communal response, which is a call to action. I believe it was dropped in the chat. Just this, in this moment, yes, the infrastructure bill kind of made its way through Congress, but there are more things to be done. And as a community of faith, we can continue to use our voices to tell Congress to make climate justice a priority, to prioritize racial equity and investing in frontline communities to reduce emissions, as well as support workers and communities in just transition to clean energy economy, and to fund the US fair share of the global effort to assist climate vulnerable countries now more than ever. So right now you can click on that link in the chat and directly go to our website and reach out to your members of Congress. So again, I just want to say thank you. Thank you for being here tonight, for watching, for participating with your questions. Thank you for our expert panel, Reverend Dr. Diane Glaze, Reverend Dr. Christopher Carter, and Helen. Just the wealth of the information and experience and expertise that you bring has been such a gift. And I hope in the future, we can continue to collaborate and have more of these conversations and bring more people in as well. I also want to thank Reverend Dr. L.A. McCrae, Linda Bloom, Kathy Gilbert, Elena Bettis for the graphic. This event could not have been done without so many people. So grateful for each and every single one of you. And with that, I just want to close us in prayer on this Environmental Justice Day. Not yet, of course. I hope you go outside and connect with leaders in your community on August 29th. But may we turn to the psalmist from Psalm 91 that reads, "Lord, you have been our dwelling place in all generations. Before the mountains were brought forth, and forever you have formed the earth and the world. From everlasting to everlasting, you are God." Beloved, may we never forget in this time and throughout time that the dwelling place that God created, this earth, this world, our community, is for all generations, now and after us. May we continue to work towards a future for us all. We pray this in the love and grace that is our God and in Son Jesus. Amen. Thank you all for participating, and we'll see you next time.